Good evening, Stevie, and thank you for having me on the program this evening. And welcome to all of our listeners on the Blog Talk platform or whichever one you happen to be listening on. Thank you for taking time to be with us and study God's Word. And I'm also posting a video of this to my YouTube channel. It's Steve Cordell's Let Us Study Together. I've got some PowerPoint slides with some of the points on it that I'm going to be making this evening to answer this question. It's an anonymous question from the nation of Nigeria wanting to know, is it a sin to wear crosses around our necks as jewelry? Now, as I was preparing this answer, I thought of some other things that we do, and I'm going to tie them into the question of things, for instance, t-shirts that people like to wear advertising their faith, or ball caps. I've got one here that says, God is good all the time. And is it okay to wear jewelry or wear anything like that out in public to show our faith? Now, just a little bit about my background. When I became a Christian in the mid 1980s, the wearing of any cross or religious themed item of clothing or jewelry in the congregation where I was highly discouraged. It was something that we were advised simply not to do. And then among conservative churches of Christ, the very conservative, the ones that we might refer to as non-institutional or anti, the use of religious symbols is really avoided. Most of the times, it can be a little difficult to do this because so much of what we order and use in our church buildings has already got religious symbols on them. For instance, you order a set of communion trays, the lids that go on them many times have the handle is in the shape of a cross. Now, some might just remove that and put a little bulb or a something else on there that use that's not a cross or anything that might be considered religious. Now, why is that? Why do we typically discourage the wearing of religious themed items? Well, some have told me that they think it cheapens Christ and the gospel. And some of these debates and discussions still go on today, at least among some of the churches of Christ. I don't know about other churches or religious groups. Some will argue not only does it cheapen Christ and the gospel, but early Christians didn't do it, that Jesus wouldn't do it. And then sort of a common fallback we see sometimes is that, well, that's something the denominations do, and we don't want to be a denomination. Now, there's several ways actually to answer this question as it was presented by the listener in Nigeria. One is we can look at the cross as an instrument of torture. It is an instrument of torture and death, and therefore we shouldn't wear it. I heard somebody once ask if Jesus had been executed instead of on a cross, if somebody had used a shotgun, would we be wearing shotguns around our neck and putting shotguns on display in our church buildings? You can do with that what you will, but there is a point, I think, to be made of what the cross was used for, and that we don't use other instruments of torture and death as signs of our faith or anything else. A second thing to keep in mind is that the cross can become an object of worship. You look at some churches where their church buildings and the altars and the content in them receive a lot of the devotion that God should receive, and they give a lot of devotion and homage to these objects that the pagans in the Old Testament seem to give their idols. A third thing to consider is the cross maybe is simply a reminder to the wearer of Christ's sacrifice. And then there's a fourth one that I'll mention when we get towards the end of the talk here. I'm going to save that one for last. Now let's look at the text. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 8. And I've included some verses after it just to get an idea of the context. But chapter 5, verse 8 says, "You shall not make for yourself any carved image." Some translations will say any graven image. "Any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. The Lord your God, or I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. Don't ever forget that part. Now, the problem or the issue seems to be whether or not we're bowing down to these images. The Hebrew people were not to bow down or worship any statues or idols. God had forbidden them to intermarry with the nations around them because they will lead your heart after other gods. And you can look at 1 Kings chapter 11 and see what happened to Solomon for all his wisdom and what he did when he got mixed up with women of other nations. Now, James Burton Kaufman stated that to the modern mind, this prohibition seems like much ado about nothing. What could be the harm of images? Well, to begin with, the prohibition here is not against the aesthetic arts or photography or anything like that. Note the words unto thee, he uses the old King James, but unto thee or unto you, indicating that it is a religious image which are forbidden, objects of human adoration and worship. Note also, he says, that the prohibition is multiple. Religious images must not be made. Men must not bow down to them. Men must not serve them. And the reasons are profound. By its very nature, any religious image is false, being a lying presentation of what is allegedly represented. God could, and this is Gary Harlan Hall in his commentary on Deuteronomy in the College Press NIV commentary series. He said God could not be represented in any way, for he was the creator, not a part of the created world. He was also invisible. The polytheistic world was again quite different, having no reservation about representing their deities in both animal and human form. God's jealousy was a function of his exclusive covenant loyalty to Israel. He deeply cared for his people and expected exclusive loyalty in return. Because of his loyalty, God rewarded loyalty in Israel or punished disloyalty. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 9 and 10 are not stating some inexorable law of divine determinism, but expressing the greatness of God's mercy and love. So what we're seeing here is that, first of all, God is a jealous God. God could not be represented in any way through human means. He is also invisible, and his jealousy is a function of his exclusive covenant loyalty to Israel. Now remember, this is Old Testament here, but we also have to consider the pagans, that they are polytheistic. They had many gods. In fact, as far as I can tell, the Hebrews were the only monotheistic people in that region, in that time. In fact, pretty much throughout the world, all the religions had many gods, polytheistic. He says the polytheistic world was again quite different, having no reservation about representing their deities in both human and animal form. The influence of idolatry is passed down from fathers to children, just like we're supposed to pass down our faith to our children. So in the Old Testament, no, they could not make any sort of idols. They could not bow down to them, could not worship them. But we're living under the new covenant. So what do we do with that? Well, here's the thing. In Acts chapter 15, we have what's known as the Jerusalem Council, and they're having a dispute over circumcision. Should Gentile men who come into the faith have to be circumcised? So they had a back and forth and a big discussion about it. And beginning in verse 19 of Acts chapter 15, James stands up to give the decision, the decision of the court, if you will. And he says, therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogue every Sabbath. So James knows that this is a big issue with the Judaizers. So he's suggesting some recommendations here that are going to be applicable to Gentile Christians who associate with the Jewish Christians, especially those who are among the dispersion, who've been chased out of Jerusalem, which happened back in Acts chapter 8. So he's trying to promote unity among the brethren here, and he wants Christians to live together, of course, in peaceful relationships and be able to fellowship one another. So he wants them to avoid polluted food. Now, in our present day structure, this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But for Gentile believers during that time, every word in the command to abstain from things polluted by idols was meaningful. And this could have a lot to do with food, because meat in the marketplace many times was there, and it had been part of an animal that was offered to a pagan god. So it was creating issues there in the church, and God does not want his people obviously to be associated with idols. We've already seen that in the Old and the New Testament. Now, the commentators tied, most of them that I looked at, tied the clause, things polluted by idols, into food in the marketplace and that sort of thing. But it doesn't actually say food. It says to abstain from polluted by idols. Basically, anything that's been polluted by an idol is the way that I took it. So therefore, as Christians, we are not to give our honor, our reverence, or anything like that to an object. Then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, let's consider there what Paul said. And keeping in mind all the problems associated with the city of Corinth, Paul said, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say." So because idolatry, remember, is worshiping something other than the true God in the way that he wants us to, it is a very serious matter. It's a very serious, one writer called it a serious and contaminating of sins. It strikes at the very character of God when we worship an idol, because we're declaring that this, whatever this idol is our God. And so he's telling us here to flee. Get as far away from it as you can. So do not make your cross or any other object an idol or an object of worship, an object of worship that belongs to God. And if you're just wearing a cross just as a piece of jewelry, I don't see how you're worshiping it or making it any sort of an idol. What if, though, I want to wear it just as a reminder? Okay, I honestly don't know anyone who actually worships crosses or objects. I do know some of what we like to call high churches that do seem to give a little too much attention to statues and things that are in their church buildings, but I don't know anyone who actually prays to an object the way, say, the ancient people might pray to a tree or to some idol they have made. But so don't make that as an idol. But if you want to have it as something just as a reminder, let's say. Well, Joshua, remember, they did place some stones in the river. It tells us in Joshua chapter 4 that he called 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan. And each of you shall take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among your children, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in times to come, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever." So these are there for memorial. Notice they're not there to worship, and not really there as a religious symbol as we might think of it. They're simply a memorial. Just like we might erect a memorial to a person or an event, a battle or something like that, just to remind us. And that's what these stones were for. And sometimes I have, in fact, I have a ball cap right here that says God is good all the time. I've got t-shirts that have religious messages on them. And when I wear those out in public, it is a reminder to me to behave in a Christian manner. And sometimes we get catalogs with various religious themed t-shirts and jewelry. And I've got some slides on the YouTube channel. I'm not endorsing any company or product, just showing some samples here. In fact, I don't even name the company whose catalog I got these from. But sometimes we will wear these maybe as a reminder. Now, I'm not one who wears a lot of jewelry. I wear my wedding ring, and that's it. I haven't worn a watch even in about 20 years, ever since I started using a cell phone. Just didn't see the need to have a watch anymore. Some people do wear a lot of jewelry. And so when we are looking at this and a reminder, we can see the cross as an instrument of death. Some people see it that way and won't wear it. Some are afraid of it becoming an object of worship. And then the cross can be a reminder of Jesus' sacrifice. But here's another reason people sometimes will wear a cross. And the wearer just simply thinks it's cool, it's stylish, it's fashionable. It's sentimental. Grandma gave me this cross on my 10th birthday or something. They could be wearing it for that reason. Now, here's a caveat. And I don't know if the person who submitted this question is male or female, or what the cultural norms of his or her society are. And understand we do live under the new covenant now. We don't live under the old covenant. But here is something to keep in mind when you are wearing a cross or any kind of jewelry. 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul said, I desire therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting, and in a like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Now, notice this is not prohibiting jewelry or anything like that. I went to school with some preachers' kids. There were 4 kids in the family. I went to school with 3 out of the 4. And I one time asked one of them, because I noticed their parents didn't wear wedding rings. In fact, none of the married people wore wedding rings. I didn't see any chains. The only jewelry, if you want to call it that I saw anybody wear was a wristwatch. So I asked about this, and he said, well, because we think it would be worldly mindedness. That if I can wear a wedding ring on this finger, what about wearing a ring on this other finger? And then going to gold chains and necklaces and that sort of thing. And you do with that what you will. But to some folks, that is a concern. But Paul here in 1 Timothy is adding to instructions on the behavior of women some wardrobe issues, obviously, and looking at these items as examples of impropriety in the Ephesian context. You know, contemporary application appeals to modesty. He had in mind attitude and character of these Christian women, that they adorn in modest apparel with propriety. Okay, that they don't get really fancy with their clothing. And I think there's an application here that men can pick up on, that whatever we wear, we should not be showing off fancy clothing like James talked about, to where we're expecting any kind of special attention or anything like that. We need to be reflecting Christ. And to what degree would wearing braided hair, gold or pearl or anything like that by a Christian woman limit her ability to represent Christ is something she's going to have to answer for her own community and her own culture and her own situation. Again, I don't know much about Nigeria. In fact, I don't know anything about Nigeria, but I can think of some situations here where someone going in dressed as Paul is describing here, it would create some problems. But on the other hand, I can think of some places where you might go in with some braided hair and something fancy and nobody's going to look twice at you. Now, in this word for modest, here's another mistake we make sometimes, is we try to take our 21st century English and use it to define first century Greek words. This word here for modest is a word that refers to order or arrangement. What is orderly? What is decent? The ancient writer Plato presents someone who is, as a citizen, who is quietly fulfilling the duties that are required or incumbent on him and is not living in a disorderly way. Plato associates such a person, just as Paul does, with a sensible, self-controlled one who voluntarily places limitations on his own freedom. And this is from the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the New Testament. So the virtues of this word, which is kosmoios, K-O-S-M-I-O-S, is not only the propriety of dress and demeanor, but of our inner lives and our expressing of our lives. So looking back at the question, is it a sin to wear a cross around our necks as a piece of jewelry? My answer, just to sum it all up and tie it up as best as I can in a nice, neat little package, is wearing a cross is not a sin if it is not an idol or object of worship. And this would go for baseball caps or t-shirts with religious messages on it. If it is modest, it's not a sin. If the wearer is not violating his or her conscience, that we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, where he's speaking specifically of eating of meat offered to idols. But if something is going to violate your conscience, you shouldn't do it. And you should not force anyone else to violate their conscience. And then again, something else I had thought of as I was putting this together was the cultural norms of your area. Again, I don't know this person's norms for their culture or their community. If there is something in your community that it would be an offense for you to wear a cross to the church assembly or out in public, then I would not wear it. Save it for another time if you're around people maybe that it doesn't bother. But if it is going to be a hindrance to you preaching the gospel, definitely do not wear it. So maybe I've muddied the waters a little bit more, but that's the answer that I have. If you have any questions, you can contact me through 2timothy4.2.3@gmail.com, and I can give answers to questions, or through my YouTube channel, social media. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Stevie. Thanks for the opportunity to answer this question. We'll see you on the next broadcast.